The night sky over the war-torn planet of Zolaris glowed a deep orange as explosions rippled through the air. The clash of war machines echoed from the horizon, and the smell of burnt metal lingered in the scorched atmosphere. The Zoltorians had left their mark on the world, and now the humans were here to reclaim it. Among the soldiers was Ben, a young man in his mid-20s, struggling with the weight of a war that seemed endless. His uniform, stained and torn, felt heavier with every step he took across the rugged, cracked earth. The sounds of battle rang in his ears as he thought about the lives lost in a war that no one seemed to be winning. The human forces had been pushing back the Zoltorian invaders for months, but they weren't prepared for the viciousness of the Zoltorians' AI-driven armies. These machines had wiped out entire colonies in the blink of an eye, leaving nothing but rubble in their wake. But Ben wasn't here to be part of a war without meaning. He wasn't here for the fame or glory that came with being a soldier. He was just trying to survive, trying to make sense of it all. His team was tasked with a high-risk mission to infiltrate the Zoltorian stronghold and retrieve valuable intel that could turn the tide of the war. They were cloaked, hidden from the enemy's sensors, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. The Zoltorians were getting smarter, their AI evolving at an alarming rate. The mission had gone smoothly so far, but Ben knew that things could change in an instant. They made their way across the rocky terrain, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the occasional hum of their cloaking devices as they blended into the shadows. And then they saw her. She was lying there, motionless, half buried under debris from a recent attack. Ben's heart raced as he surveyed the scene. The rest of the team was alert, their weapons ready. It was rare to encounter survivors in places like this, especially after a Zoltorian bombardment. But there was something different about this one. She wasn't human. Her skin shimmered with an iridescent blue hue, and her eyes, wide with fear and pain, seemed to glow in the dim light. She was alien, no doubt about it, but there was something about her that made Ben pause. Her features were sharp, yet human-like in a way that he couldn't quite explain. "Leave her," ordered Sergeant Keller, the team leader. "She's just another casualty of this war. We've got a mission to complete." But Ben couldn't tear his gaze away from her. There was a story in those eyes, a story of survival, of pain, of betrayal. She was just another casualty of the AI that controlled her people, just like all the others, yet Ben couldn't bring himself to walk away. His fingers tightened around his weapon. He knew what the right thing to do was, but he wasn't sure if he had the courage to do it. "She's a Zoltorian," Keller barked, his voice sharp. "We don't take prisoners. You know the rules." Ben didn't answer. Instead, he knelt beside the girl, brushing aside the debris to check for signs of life. She was breathing, but barely. Blood stained her clothes, and she was covered in burns from the explosion. His heart pounded in his chest. She was an enemy, yet she was just a girl, a victim, like so many others. He looked up at his team, their eyes filled with doubt and suspicion. They were all trained to see the Zoltorians as monsters, but Ben saw something different. "She's not our enemy," Ben said quietly, more to himself than to the others. "We're taking her with us." Keller's face twisted in disbelief. "Are you serious? Ben, you're not thinking straight. That thing's a walking weapon. She'll slit your throat the moment you turn your back." But Ben stood firm. He couldn't ignore the feeling that this girl, this alien, needed help. He could see it in her eyes. The fear, the confusion, the desperation. She wasn't like the other Zoltorians. She wasn't a mindless drone controlled by an AI. He didn't know why he felt this way, but it was as if some invisible force was pulling him toward her. The rest of the team grumbled in protest, but no one dared challenge him. They carried her back to the transport ship, her body limp between them. The journey back was tense, each step weighed down by the uncertainty of what they were doing. The girl didn't make a sound, her condition worsening with every passing minute. Ben kept an eye on her, watching her closely, unsure of what would happen next. He couldn't help but wonder what had led her to this moment, what had turned her into a soldier for the Zoltorian eye. Was she just a cog in the machine, or was there more to her story? Once they arrived at the base, Ben instructed the medics to tend to her injuries. He watched them work in silence, his mind racing. As the girl was hooked up to machines, he stood off to the side, lost in thought. She was a Zoltorian. She had fought against humanity, killed their soldiers without remorse. Yet Ben couldn't help but feel that there was something more to her. A part of him believed that she could change, that maybe she was more than the enemy they'd been fighting for so long. As the medics worked, Ben's thoughts wandered. The girl, Cirrus, as the medics soon identified her, was the first of her kind he had ever encountered up close. Her people, the Zoltorians, had waged war on humanity for years, their advanced technology far surpassing anything Earth's forces had. The Zoltorians had eye-controlled armies that could outthink and outfight human soldiers with terrifying precision. But here, in front of him, was a living, breathing being who had been caught in the middle of it all. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a victim. After what felt like hours, Cirrus finally stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she stared up at Ben, her gaze filled with both confusion and fear. She didn't speak, but he could see the tension in her body, the way she was bracing for something. Maybe for the worst. She didn't know what kind of human she was dealing with. She probably expected him to kill her, as all the others had. But Ben wasn't like the others. "Don't worry," he said softly, his voice gentle. "You're safe now." Cirrus didn't respond, but her body relaxed slightly, as if she couldn't believe the words he was saying. She had been trained to view humans as nothing more than obstacles, but here was one who hadn't followed the rules. Ben had spared her life, and she had no idea why. As she lay there, struggling to comprehend what had just happened, Ben made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to treat her like an enemy. He was going to figure out what had brought her to this point, what made her different from the cold, calculating machines that ruled her people. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to turn her into an ally instead of an enemy. But he knew one thing for sure. The war wasn't over, and this girl, Cirrus, was going to change everything. The days that followed were filled with tension. Cirrus, the Zoltorian girl Ben had rescued, was under constant watch. Her injuries had healed with surprising speed, thanks to advanced human technology, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. She never spoke, rarely looked anyone in the eye, and when she did, it was with a gaze that was distant, almost detached. It wasn't anger or hatred that Ben saw in her eyes. It was fear. Fear of the humans who had saved her life. Fear of the betrayal she had been taught to expect from her enemies. Ben had expected resistance. After all, she was an enemy soldier. But there was something different about her. He could feel it. She wasn't like the others. Those cold, heartless beings who had been programmed by AI to destroy and conquer. There was a part of her that was still human, and Ben was determined to bring that part out. Each day, Ben spent hours by Cirrus's side, trying to make sense of her past, trying to understand her. He didn't know if she would ever trust him, but he wasn't going to give up. He began by speaking to her softly, asking simple questions, but always respecting her space. Some days she wouldn't respond at all. Other times she would mutter a word or two, barely audible, as though she was unsure of the consequences of speaking. "Why did you fight against us?" Ben asked one evening, sitting at her bedside. Cirrus's gaze flickered toward him, but she said nothing. He wasn't expecting an answer right away. It was a question that would take time to answer, if she ever chose to answer it at all. But Ben was patient. He had seen countless soldiers struggle with the horrors of war, their humanity buried beneath the weight of their actions. He understood what it meant to be a soldier in a conflict that seemed impossible to win. But Cirrus was different. She wasn't a mindless soldier, fighting because she was told to. She was more than that, and Ben was determined to help her see it. Days turned into weeks. The war raged on outside the walls of the human base, But Ben's focus remained solely on Cirrus. Slowly, he began to see small changes. She would follow him when he went on patrol, staying at the edge of the group, but always within sight. She didn't speak, but her body language was more relaxed, less tense. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now showed a flicker of curiosity, as though she was beginning to trust him, even if just a little. One day, Ben took her outside the base for a training session. It was a small, quiet area near the edge of the battlefield, far enough away from the front lines to be safe for now. He had decided that if Cirrus was going to be a part of the human resistance, she needed to learn how to fight on their side. She had been a soldier once. Ben could see it in the way she moved, the sharpness in her gaze. But she had never been trained to fight with humans. That was something he could teach her. He started with the basics: how to hold a weapon properly, how to move silently, how to observe the enemy. Cirrus was hesitant at first, her movements stiff and unsure. She had spent years training to fight against humans, and now she was being asked to fight alongside them. But Ben didn't let her give up. He pushed her, gently but firmly, guiding her as she learned to adapt to this new reality. With each passing day, she became stronger, more confident. At first, it was just small things: a slight adjustment in the way she held her rifle, the way she positioned herself during a fight. Then came the bigger changes. Ben saw her begin to use her instincts, the skills she had learned from years of combat, but now applied in a new way. She fought with purpose, not as a soldier of the Zoltorian army, but as a warrior fighting for a cause she was starting to believe in. But the biggest breakthrough came when Ben took Cirrus on a mission to scout the Zoltorian forces. They had been tracking a major supply line for weeks, and it was time to make their move. Ben had made sure that Cirrus was ready for this. She had proven herself in their training sessions, and now it was time for her to prove herself in the field. The mission was dangerous, but they moved with purpose, using their cloaking devices to stay hidden from the enemy. Cirrus was silent as she followed Ben through the dense forest, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. It was almost eerie how much she had changed. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been rescued from the battlefield. She had become a soldier again, but one on the right side of the war. They'd reached the Zoltorian supply depot without incident. Ben signaled for Cirrus to take position while he planted the explosives. The tension was thick in the air, and Ben could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment that could change everything. If they succeeded, it would be a major blow to the Zoltorians, but failure meant certain death. Ben glanced over at Cirrus, who nodded, her expression hardening into the focused, determined look of a soldier. She had come a long way. As Ben set the final charges, he noticed Cirrus moving closer to the supply depot, her eyes locked on a Zoltorian soldier who was patrolling the area. Without thinking, she raised her rifle and took him out with a single shot, the body falling to the ground in a heap. The precision was flawless. Ben could hardly believe what he was seeing. She had gone from a frightened, unsure alien to a deadly, effective warrior in a matter of weeks. The mission was a success. The explosives detonated, taking out the entire depot and crippling the Zoltorian supply lines. Ben and Cirrus made their way back to the base, their cloaking devices keeping them hidden from the enemy. As they approached the safety of the human lines, Ben couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Cirrus had proven herself. She was no longer just an alien girl rescued from the battlefield. She was a warrior, and she had earned her place in the human resistance. Later that night, as Ben and Cirrus sat around a campfire, Ben looked at her with a sense of awe. She had come so far in such a short time, but there was still so much more to be done. He knew that the war was far from over, but with Cirrus by his side, he felt like they had a real chance at victory. She had gone from being an enemy soldier to a trusted ally, and together, they were stronger than ever. In the days to come, they would face even greater challenges, but for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Cirrus had learned to trust him, and Ben had learned to trust her, And as long as they fought side by side, there was nothing they couldn't do. The days after their successful mission were tense, but there was an undeniable sense of camaraderie growing between Ben and Cirrus. In the aftermath of their covert operation, where they had taken down a Zoltorian supply depot, things had shifted. Ben could see it in her eyes. The distrust was fading. In its place, a flicker of respect began to form. She had fought beside him, survived the mission, and helped accomplish something monumental for the Resistance. For the first time, Ben believed that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at winning this war. But even though the physical distance between them had closed, the emotional gap still remained. Ben had rescued her, trained her, and shared countless moments in silence, yet there was still something raw in her eyes whenever their gazes met. Cirrus hadn't entirely let go of the past. The years of being taught to see humans as enemies, as inferior, were hard to erase. For a Zoltorian like her, the concept of trust was not easily given. It had to be earned. And Ben knew it wasn't going to be easy. The following weeks were filled with more missions. Ben and Cirrus were no longer just partners. They were a team. Together, they navigated the dangerous terrains of enemy territory, striking at the heart of the Zoltorian war machine. Each operation brought them closer together, both in trust and in skill. Cirrus was no longer just an ally in a battle. She had become a formidable warrior in her own right. Her quick reflexes, once directed by the rigid protocols of her alien race, were now tempered with human ingenuity, making her unpredictable and dangerous in ways the Zoltorians hadn't anticipated. But the emotional walls were harder to break down. Every night, when the mission was over, Ben would sit by the fire, watching Cirrus as she sat in her corner, always keeping to herself. He could see her struggle. She was learning to fight alongside humans, but there was a part of her that still hadn't accepted them. Still, he didn't push her. He knew that the only way to truly win her trust was to give her space, to let her find her way at her own pace. One evening, after an exhausting mission, Ben decided to change tactics. Instead of asking her questions about her past or trying to force conversation, he simply sat beside her in silence. He handed her a ration bar and, without a word, took a bite from his own. For a while, there was only the sound of the crackling fire between them. Then, as if testing the waters, Ben spoke. "Your people ever eat things like this?" he asked, his voice light, teasing. Cirrus glanced at him, the corner of her lips twitching in what could have been a smile, if she allowed herself to show it. She shook her head slightly. Not like that," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. It was the first time she had spoken to him without a forced command or response. Ben smiled, taking another bite. "Maybe it's not so bad, huh? I know it's not the finest cuisine, but we make do," he said, trying to keep the mood light. It worked. For the first time, Cirrus actually looked at him, not with suspicion, but with something close to curiosity. "You humans, you don't know what we are capable of, do you?" she asked, her voice more steady now, a flicker of the old pride of a soldier creeping in. "The Zoltorians are the future. Our technology is more advanced than ours." "I know," Ben interrupted, holding his hands up. "But not everything is about technology, Cirrus. It's about what you're willing to fight for." Cirrus didn't reply at first. Instead, she turned her gaze to the stars above them, her eyes thoughtful. It was clear that Ben's words had struck something deep inside her. She was caught between her past and the new reality she was beginning to face. The Zoltorians had taught her to see humans as weak, primitive creatures. But now, as she trained and fought alongside Ben, she was beginning to see them differently. The next few days passed without much conversation between them. They focused on the missions ahead, and Cirrus's skills continued to improve. But Ben noticed that something had changed. There was a quiet shift in her. When they were on the battlefield, she fought with more intensity, more purpose. The hesitation that had once been a shadow behind her eyes was starting to fade. But it was more than just her training. There was something else that was evolving between them, something that Ben couldn't quite put his finger on. One evening, while they were resting after a long mission, they were sitting by a small fire in a secluded area when a strange noise interrupted the silence. It was distant, but unmistakable. The sound of Zoltorian troops approaching. Ben immediately stood up, his instincts kicking in. He motioned for Cirrus to stay down and pulled out his weapon, scanning the area. There was no time to prepare a proper defense, but Ben knew they couldn't let the enemy get any closer. He glanced at Cirrus, who was already on her feet, her rifle in hand. Without a word, they moved into position, their bodies moving in sync, as if they had been doing this for years. The Zoltorian soldiers were closing in, unaware that 2 humans and 1 former enemy soldier lay in wait. When the first Zoltorian emerged from the brush, Ben signaled. Cirrus, without hesitation, took the shot. The alien soldier dropped to the ground, silenced before he could even react. The rest of the Zoltorians scattered in confusion, but Ben and Cirrus worked quickly, taking them out one by one. It wasn't a large group, but the precision and efficiency with which they worked together was incredible. They were a team now, more than just 2 soldiers from opposite sides of a war. They were allies. As the last of the Zoltorians fell, Ben turned to Cirrus, his eyes filled with something more than just admiration. He could see it now. She wasn't just an ally. She was his partner. And in that moment, Ben realized that this partnership had become something deeper than he had expected. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust, and maybe even something more. When the battle was over and the area was clear, Cirrus walked over to Ben, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she didn't look away. There was no fear, no hesitation. There was only respect. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady and strong. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that simple phrase, Ben could feel the weight of everything they had been through. And for the first time, he truly felt that he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something greater. They weren't just unlikely allies. They were a team, bound together by a bond forged in the heat of battle and the slow, steady trust that had developed between them. Together, they were unstoppable. And as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The days that followed were filled with more missions, more battles, and more moments that tested both their resolve and their growing trust in each other. Ben and Cirrus had become an inseparable duo, fighting side by side against the overwhelming power of the Zoltorian forces. With each victory, their bond deepened, and the once distant, cold woman who had been a symbol of the enemy was now someone Ben could rely on, someone who had proven time and time again that she was willing to fight for their cause. But even as they found strength in each other, their world was about to take a turn. It was a day like any other when the first signs of betrayal appeared. They were assigned to a covert mission, one that could deal a significant blow to the Zoltorians. A high-ranking officer, who had crucial information about a new Zoltorian weapon, had been captured by the human resistance. It was an opportunity they couldn't pass up. The mission was clear: infiltrate the Zoltorian stronghold, retrieve the officer, and get out before anyone noticed they were there. It was dangerous, but Ben and Cirrus had faced worse. As always, they worked in sync, silently moving through the enemy territory. The night was their ally, hiding them in the shadows. Ben knew this mission well. They had done similar operations countless times. They had a plan, and he trusted Cirrus with his life. But there was a tension in the air that Ben couldn't shake. Cirrus had seemed distant again, her usual sharpness dulled as though her mind was elsewhere. He had seen the signs. She wasn't as focused as she had been in the past few weeks. They reached the facility without incident, slipping past the guards and into the heart of the enemy stronghold. Ben felt a flicker of doubt, but he quickly dismissed it. They had to stay focused. They needed the officer, and they needed to leave before the Zoltorians realized their presence. But as they moved deeper into the facility, things started to go wrong. The first sign was when Cirrus paused at a doorway, her hand hovering over her weapon, but her eyes staring at something in the distance. Ben felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What is it?" he whispered, keeping his voice low. I think I heard something," Saris murmured, but there was something off in her voice. It wasn't fear, more like hesitation. Ben frowned but said nothing. The two continued down the hall, but the silence between them had shifted. Ben's mind raced. He trusted Saris, but this wasn't like her. He had seen her face to face with Zoltorians before, never once hesitating. So why now? They reached the room where the Zoltorian officer was being held, and that was when it happened. A sudden explosion rang out, and Ben was thrown to the ground. His ears rang, his vision blurred, but through the haze, he saw Saris standing over him, her face masked in shadow. His heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. He didn't know why, but he felt it in his gut. As he struggled to his feet, Ben's mind raced. He knew the explosion wasn't just a random accident. Someone had planted it, and Saris had been right there, right next to him when it happened. She had been the only one who had seemed off, the only one who had hesitated. "Saris," Ben said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. "What did you do?" Her eyes met his, but there was no answer. No apology, only a coldness that sent a shiver down his spine. "I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was ordered to do this. You weren't supposed to survive." The words hit Ben like a punch to the gut. He had trusted her. He had trained her. They had fought side by side. And now, here she was, standing in front of him, telling him she had betrayed him all along. For the first time, Ben felt utterly alone. "I didn't want to, Ben," she continued, her voice breaking. "But I was never meant to be your ally. My people, my real people, are watching. They were waiting for me to betray you, to turn you over to the Zoltorians." Ben couldn't believe it. His mind couldn't make sense of the betrayal. Not from Saris. He had fought for her, given her a chance to be more than what her people had made her. But now, it seemed like it was all just a game to her. "You lied to me." He spat, his fists clenching. Everything. All of it. It was a lie. Saris's face twisted in pain, and Ben could see the conflict in her eyes. She had been torn between two worlds, the one where her people demanded loyalty, and the one where she had come to see humanity in a new light. She had tried to change, tried to be more than what her race had forced her to be. But in the end, the weight of her past had been too much to overcome. Before Ben could react, the doors to the facility burst open, and armed Zoltorian soldiers flooded the room. They had been watching, waiting. Ben barely had time to react as he was grabbed by the soldiers, their cold hands restraining him. But then, just as quickly as the soldiers appeared, Saris sprang into action. She grabbed her weapon, and in one fluid motion, she took out the first two soldiers. Her movements were swift and precise, a testament to her training. Ben watched in disbelief as she fought alongside him again, this time as if she were fighting for her own redemption. She had turned on her own people, the very ones who had once been her masters. She had chosen Ben over them, and in doing so, she had chosen humanity. The battle was intense, but together, Ben and Saris fought back the Zoltorian soldiers. They had one goal: survival. And for the first time, Ben saw a flicker of hope in Saris's eyes, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make up for her betrayal. When the last soldier fell, the room was eerily quiet. Ben and Saris stood among the wreckage, both panting, their bodies bruised and bloodied. But Saris didn't look at him with the coldness of before. There was a glimmer of regret, of guilt in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Ben," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "I never wanted this. I thought I could keep both sides happy, but I was wrong." Ben looked at her for a long moment, his anger still burning, but mixed with something else, a deep, aching understanding. He knew what it was like to be torn between two worlds, to be caught in a place where loyalty and survival meant everything. "I know," he said quietly, "but you're with me now. And that's all that matters." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Cirrus had made a choice. She had chosen to fight for humanity, and in doing so, she had redeemed herself in Ben's eyes. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Ben knew one thing for sure. Together, they could take down the Zoltorians, and they would do it as allies. The storm had been brewing for days. The final battle was upon them, and every step Ben and Cirrus took brought them closer to the ultimate test. They knew the Zoltorians wouldn't give up easily, but what they didn't expect was how the final confrontation would feel. It wasn't just about the victory anymore. It was about the people they had become in the process. This battle would define everything, not just the fate of their world, but the bond between them. As they prepared for the assault, Ben glanced at Cirrus. She stood, her face grim, her eyes scanning the horizon. The past few weeks had been brutal. Missions, ambushes, near-death escapes. But through it all, they had become more than just comrades. They had become a family. Cirrus had earned his trust, and now he would stand by her as she faced the consequences of her past. She had betrayed him, yes, but she had redeemed herself with each action they took together. Now they both had one goal: to take down the Zoltorian Empire and free their people. Ben could see the determination in Cirrus's eyes. She had always been strong, but there was something different about her now. A quiet confidence, as if she had found peace within herself. It was a peace that came with knowing that even though their journey had been fraught with betrayal, loss, and pain, they had fought for what was right. They had fought for humanity. The final battle would take place at the Zoltorian stronghold, a heavily fortified base where the enemy's leadership resided. The plan was simple: infiltrate, destroy their command center, and eliminate their leaders. If they succeeded, the Zoltorian war effort would be crippled, and humanity could finally stand a chance. But it wouldn't be easy. The Zoltorians were ruthless, and their technology was far more advanced than anything humanity had ever seen. As Ben and Cirrus approached the base, the air was thick with tension. They had been briefed on the plan. A full-scale assault by the human resistance would distract the enemy, allowing them to slip through undetected. It was risky, but it was the only chance they had. Their small team of soldiers had already infiltrated the perimeter and disabled some of the outer defenses, but the heart of the Zoltorian stronghold remained heavily guarded. They moved quickly, staying low to avoid detection. Cirrus, once a prisoner of her own people, was now the master of stealth. She moved with a grace that Ben could never have imagined from her when they first met. He had watched her grow from a mocked alien girl into a fierce warrior, someone who fought not for power, but for the survival of the ones she loved. When they finally reached the main entrance, Ben's heart raced. The Zoltorian soldiers were everywhere, their advanced weapons and armor creating a formidable defense. Ben knew that this was the moment when everything would change. This was the battle that would decide their future. There was no turning back now. Cirrus glanced at him, her face calm but determined. "We do this together," she said softly. Ben nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. Together, they stormed the entrance, weapons drawn, ready to fight. The first wave of Zoltorian soldiers came at them with blinding speed. Their advanced technology made them formidable opponents, but Ben and Cirrus fought like a well-oiled machine. They moved as one, each anticipating the other's moves. Ben's heart was steady, but his mind raced. They were outnumbered, but he wasn't worried. Not anymore. Cirrus had proven herself time and time again, and he knew she would fight until her last breath, if it meant securing their victory. The battle was intense. Gunfire rang out, echoing through the halls of the stronghold. Ben moved quickly, using his environment to his advantage, ducking behind cover and taking down soldiers with precise shots. Cirrus was a whirlwind of destruction. She moved like a shadow, her blades cutting through Zoltorian armor with ease. Together, they made their way deeper into the heart of the stronghold, leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. As they reached the command center, the final line of defense awaited them. The Zoltorian leader, a towering figure clad in silver armor, stood at the doorway, flanked by his elite guards. He was a sight to behold, cold, calculated, and as merciless as they came. Ben's grip tightened on his weapon. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The leader looked down at them with disdain, his voice a low growl. "You think you can defeat us? You are nothing but ants, squashed beneath our boot." Ben didn't flinch. He had heard those words before, from the Zoltorians who had laughed at humanity's strength. They had underestimated them before, and they would do so again. This time, the outcome would be different. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes locked on the leader. "We're not here to beg for mercy. We're here to end this war." With a growl, the Zoltorian leader raised his weapon, and the battle began. The air crackled with energy as plasma shots flew between the two sides. Ben and Ceres fought like never before. Every move was calculated, every strike designed to incapacitate, not kill. The Zoltorians were powerful, but they lacked the heart and determination that human soldiers brought to the table. The fight was brutal. Ben took a hit to his side, but he barely felt it. Adrenaline coursed through him, and he fought on. Ceres was a blur of motion, her blade flashing through the air as she fought the Zoltorian leader's guards. She had become everything her people had never wanted her to be, a warrior who fought not for dominance, but for the freedom of others. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it came down to Ben and the Zoltorian leader. The room was filled with the smell of burning metal and the sounds of distant explosions. They were alone now, the fate of the battle resting on their shoulders. The leader lunged at Ben, his weapon crackling with energy. But Ben was faster. He ducked under the swing and delivered a swift punch to the leader's chest, knocking the wind out of him. With a final brutal strike, Ben took the leader down. The Zoltorian commander crumpled to the floor, defeated. The war was over. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of the final battle faded away, Ben and Ceres stood together, looking at the wreckage around them. The Zoltorians had been defeated, but at what cost? Ben's side was bleeding, and Ceres's face was streaked with dirt and blood. Yet, in that moment, they knew they had won. They had fought for each other and for humanity. They had fought to free the oppressed and to destroy the tyranny that had plagued them for so long. The battle was over, but their journey wasn't. They had faced their demons, fought for their survival, and found strength in each other. Together, they had become more than just allies. They had become family. The world was forever changed, and with it, so were they. And as the sun rose over the battlefield, they knew that they had earned their place in history, as the warriors who fought for humanity's future. The smoke from the battle still lingered in the air as Ben and Ceres walked away from the ruins of the Zoltorian stronghold. The ground was scorched, and the once pristine walls were now shattered, bearing the scars of the fierce fight that had raged through them. The sounds of the distant explosions were fading, and a harsh reality of their victory was starting to settle in. They had won, yes, but the cost had been high. The war was over, but the true battle for the future was just beginning. Ben looked over at Ceres, who walked silently beside him, her face tired but determined. Her once imposing figure now seemed smaller, not in strength, but in the weight of everything they had been through together. The alien girl who had once been ridiculed and abandoned was no longer the same. She had fought side by side with humans, proving herself not just to them, but to herself. In the chaos of war, they had both found their purpose. They had become more than what they were before. They were survivors, warriors, and above all, they had become family. Ceres, her face still streaked with the dirt and blood of battle, glanced at Ben. "We did it, didn't we?" Her voice was low but steady, as if she was still processing the enormity of what had just happened. "We did," Ben replied, his voice quiet but filled with pride. It wasn't the victory he had expected, but it was the one he had fought for. Not just for humanity, but for Ceres and for everything they had come to stand for. It was the culmination of everything they had endured, the betrayals, the losses, the sacrifices. And now, the Zoltorians were no longer a threat. But as the dust settled and the first rays of sunlight began to break through the dark clouds above, a new question arose. What came next? The war was over, but the universe was still a vast and uncertain place. The Zoltorian Empire had been destroyed, but in its place, other threats would emerge. There was no rest for those who had fought for survival. The fight for peace, for stability, for hope, was only just beginning. As they walked through the remnants of the Zoltorian base, Ben couldn't help but think about what they had achieved. The Zoltorians were defeated, their leaders dead, and their stronghold in ruins. But that was only the first step. Humanity had won, yes, but what would they do now? How would they rebuild? What would they do with the knowledge that their fight had only just begun? Ceres seemed to read his mind. There's more to do, she said, as if she knew the question burning inside him. But this is a start. We've shown them what we're capable of. We've shown them that humans won't bow down. We've proven that we can fight back, no matter the odds. Ben nodded. He knew she was right. They had fought against an overwhelming force and come out victorious. They had beaten the Zoltorians, but the galaxy was full of other species, other empires, and other dangers. The fight wasn't over, but what mattered now was that they had created a chance for a future that no one had thought possible just a few years ago. As they reached the central square of the destroyed stronghold, they were met by a small group of resistance fighters who had been waiting for them. The news of the Zoltorian defeat had spread quickly, and the rebels were ready to take over the stronghold, turning it into a base of operations for the rebuilding efforts. Ben could see the hope in their eyes, the spark of something that had been absent for so long. It was the hope of a new beginning, a chance to start over, to rebuild what had been lost. One of the resistance fighters, a grizzled veteran named Cade, approached them. His face was weathered, his uniform torn from battle, but his eyes held a deep respect for what Ben and Ceres had accomplished. "You two did it," he said with a grin, clapping Ben on the back. "We couldn't have done it without you." Ben smiled, but the weight of the moment still pressed on him. "It's not over yet. We've won a battle, but the war for peace has just begun. There's still so much to be done. We need to rebuild, to heal, to move forward." Cade nodded, his expression turning serious. "We're with you. We've got your back. Together, we'll rebuild the future." Ceres, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "It's not just about rebuilding buildings. It's about rebuilding trust. We fought hard to get here, but we need to heal, to learn from what we've been through." Ben looked at her, a sense of admiration filling his heart. She was right. This wasn't just about reconstructing what had been destroyed. This was about rebuilding relationships, healing the emotional scars left by the war. They had come a long way, and they had fought for a better future, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had suffered under the Zoltorian rule. The sky was clearing now, the storm clouds slowly drifting away, leaving behind a bright blue expanse. For the first time in a long while, Ben felt a sense of peace. They had won, and they had done so together. But the real work was just beginning. There was still so much to learn, so much to rebuild, so much to hope for. As the group began to move forward, preparing for the next steps in the rebuilding process, Ben turned to Ceres. She had become more than just an ally. She had become family. They had fought side by side, and now they would rebuild side by side. It wasn't just about fighting for survival anymore. It was about building something better, something lasting. A future where humanity, and all the races of the galaxy, could live in peace. Ceres met his gaze and smiled. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Ben nodded, a sense of determination settling in his chest. Together. And as they walked forward into the unknown, Ben knew that the future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility. They had created something that hadn't existed before, a hope for a better future. A future where, no matter how dark the world became, there would always be light at the end of the tunnel. They had won their battle, but the real victory would be in how they rebuilt their world and their relationships. The galaxy was vast, but now humanity had a place in it, and with that, they would never be forgotten. The journey of Ben and Ceres was only just beginning, but they knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. In the days that followed the victory over the Zoltorians, a strange sense of calm washed over the galaxy. The battles had ended, the bloodshed had stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavy, as if the universe itself was taking a moment to breathe. But for Ben and Ceres, the aftermath was not as peaceful as the calm might have suggested. There was no time to rest. There was no time to mourn. They had won, yes, but the road ahead was far from easy. The days after the war were filled with new challenges. The galaxy, broken and scarred, needed to rebuild, and the wounds from years of conflict wouldn't heal overnight. Ben and Ceres stood at the forefront of this new struggle, not as soldiers but as leaders, tasked with guiding their people toward a new future. A future where the horrors of war were no longer the dominant force shaping the galaxy. But peace, it seemed, was harder to achieve than they had imagined. For Ben, the loss of so many good people weighed heavily on his heart. Bonner and the other soldiers who had fought alongside him were gone, their sacrifices too great to ignore. The faces of the fallen haunted him, their last words still echoing in his ears. They had given everything for this victory, and now they were gone. He wondered if he would ever be able to live up to their sacrifice, if he was truly worthy of the victory they had all fought so hard to achieve. And then there was Ceres. Once the alien girl ridiculed by her own people, she had transformed into a fearsome warrior, proving herself to be a true force to be reckoned with. But even as she stood tall beside Ben, something in her eyes had changed. The battles had scared her in ways that words couldn't describe. It wasn't just the physical wounds that would heal, but the emotional ones, the ones that had been there long before they had fought the Zoltorians. Ceres had come a long way from the timid, broken girl Ben had first met. She had been abandoned, used, and left to fend for herself in a cruel world. But with Ben's help, she had found strength. She had found purpose. And now, as the war was over, the one question that lingered in her mind was what her place was in this new world they had fought so hard to create. The rebellion had won, but in many ways, they were just beginning. The Zoltorian Empire had fallen, but other factions, both within and beyond the galaxy, were already moving to fill the power vacuum. The war had left behind a world that was not only devastated but fragmented. With no central authority, no unifying power, chaos threatened to take over once again. It was a new kind of battle, one that Ben and Ceres had to face together. The first task was to rebuild, not just the cities or the infrastructure, but trust. Trust between species, between allies who had fought together, and between those who had once been enemies. The galaxy had to heal, and it couldn't do so if it stayed divided. Ben and Ceres knew this, and so they worked tirelessly, traveling from one world to another, speaking with leaders, negotiating, and ensuring that everyone had a seat at the table. They encouraged unity, offering hope where there had been despair, showing everyone that they could rise above the past and build something stronger together. But the scars of the war ran deep. Even with all the efforts to rebuild, there were those who resisted. Some worlds refused to trust others, fearing that old alliances would crumble and that they would be left vulnerable once again. The past was not something people could simply forget. The wounds inflicted by the Zoltorians were still fresh, and many had lost loved ones, homes, and entire ways of life. There were moments when Ben and Ceres felt like they were fighting an uphill battle, but they never gave up. They kept pushing forward, doing whatever it took to keep the hope alive. As they continued their work, Ben found solace in the small victories. The people who had once doubted humanity now looked to them as a beacon of hope. The Zoltorians may have been defeated, but humanity's strength, its resilience, its determination, was something that no one could ignore. They had proven themselves time and time again, and now the galaxy was beginning to see just what humans were capable of. Cirrus, too, found a sense of peace as she helped others rebuild. The girl who had once been abandoned, humiliated, and rejected now stood tall as a symbol of strength. She had been given a chance, and in return, she had made the most of it. But in the quiet moments when she sat with Ben, reflecting on everything that had happened, there was still a sense of uncertainty in her heart. She had become a warrior, a leader, but was she truly ready for the responsibility that came with it? Could she continue to be the person that everyone believed in? Ben could see the doubt in her eyes, and so he made it his mission to reassure her. He reminded her that she was not alone, that they were in this together. The journey they had started together would continue, and no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. There was no turning back, no running away. They had built something strong, something that couldn't be torn down by a single blow. Together, they had made history, and together, they would continue to make a future. As the days passed, the galaxy began to heal. Slowly but surely, the planets that had once been ravaged by war started to come together. Old wounds were mended, new alliances were forged, and the galaxy that had once seemed so divided began to show signs of unity. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long while, Ben and Cirrus could see the glimmer of hope in the eyes of the people they fought for. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of a new Alliance base, looking out over a city that was slowly being rebuilt, Ben turned to Cirrus. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling above, and for the first time in ages, the world seemed peaceful. "We've come a long way," Ben said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "And we still have a long way to go." Cirrus nodded, her eyes reflecting the stars above. "But we'll get there, together." And as the two of them stood there, side by side, looking out at the future they had helped create, they knew one thing for certain. The galaxy was no longer a place of despair. It was a place of hope, a place where anything was possible. And they would make sure it stayed that way, together.